everybody for coming today. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about Louisiana's brown pelican, past, its present, and its future. My name is Robert Dobbs. I'm the non-game ornithologist or avian ecologist for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. And I should say, if anybody in the back has, if my voice sort of gets quiet as I talk, let me know and I'll bump up the volume again. But anyway, I'm in the Wildlife Diversity Program at LDWF. And the Wildlife Diversity Program, one of our main jobs is to maintain the Wildlife Action Plan for our state. And that's basically the roadmap for non-game conservation. We keep track of populations, status and distribution, abundance, and threats to non-game species that are of conservation concern. And so for me, the birds, non-game birds, is sort of my gig. And so we're going to talk a lot about pelicans. And so I want to start out, pretty broad. Pelicans comprise a small family called the Pelicanidae. And this is one genus, 8 species within this genus. And so all these birds, they're in the same genus. That basically means they're all pretty closely related. And they're all fairly similar ecologically. They have a worldwide distribution. If you look at the top row, you see American white pelican. Y'all may be familiar with that. It occurs in Baton Rouge, Capitol Lakes. Brown pelican next to that, that's our state bird, and that's what we're actually going to spend the vast majority of time talking about today. And then a very similar bird to brown pelican is the Peruvian pelican, which occurs on the west coast of South America, Ecuador, Peru, northern Chile. And then in the old world, there are 5 more species. The great white pelican is a widespread bird of Africa and Asia. The Australian pelican, and these kind of all look like the white pelican more or less, occurs in Australia, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands. The pink-backed pelican is strictly African. And then the last 2, spot-billed pelican and Dalmatian pelican, these are both Asian birds. And then this entire family is really closely related to cormorants and anhingas. Might be another group that y'all are familiar with, if you're familiar with Louisiana birds. We have 2 species of cormorants in Louisiana that are common. Anhingas, also, people call those snake birds. They occur in our freshwater marshes. Well, we want to dial in on our 2 North American context first. Our 2 species of pelicans, the brown pelican and the American white pelican. Brown pelicans are strictly coastal throughout their range. They don't really occur inland. They occur on both coasts of the U.S. as well as the Gulf Coast, down through coastal Mexico, Central America, and North and South America. In these maps, the blue color shows non-breeding range. Purple shows when they're in a certain place year-round. Yellow is when birds are simply migrating through an area, and red is solely where birds breed. And so brown pelican, you can see that a lot of the coastline, I don't know actually how well it shows up, but a lot of the coastline is purple. These birds don't migrate a lot in the sense that we think of migration as being really regular from year to year. They move around a lot when they're not breeding, but they don't truly migrate latitudinally regularly. But they're almost always along the coast. The blue in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean is kind of misleading. They will cross these sorts of big open bodies of water like that, but they don't occur out in deep water pelagic. They really are coastal birds. And the American white pelican really couldn't be more different. It is a freshwater inland bird, primarily. It breeds, as you can see in this map, in the northern prairies, Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, a number of places in the sort of Great Plains and the Intermountain West as well. Then they migrate through all of those areas to the south, and they winter on the Gulf Coast, big areas of Texas and Mexico, as well as California. But in all of these places, they're really kind of freshwater birds. You see them a lot in coastal Louisiana, but when they're on the coast of Louisiana, they're primarily in our coastal lakes and our marshes. So they're not really on the coast or just offshore in the nearshore areas like brown pelicans. They're a little more freshwater. And so this map might take you just a minute to sort of acclimate to. It's the same map on the left and right. And so this is Louisiana. If you look closely, you can see Shreveport in the northwest. You can see our coast kind of, especially if you look at the brown pelican map, the dark purple is basically the coastline. And these maps show, basically they reflect actual observations of each of these individual species at a blocks, sort of scale. And so basically trying to drive home that, even in Louisiana, there's sort of widespread patterns of fresh versus coastal holds true. So brown pelicans, if you look at that deep dark purples, those are where basically there's more observations of brown pelicans. The lighter purple squares there's fewer. And so they're almost all explicitly coastal or specifically coastal, or at least the coastal zone. There are a few in the northern part of Louisiana, and those are basically usually storm-blown birds. So when a hurricane comes, some of these birds will get blown inland. They'll find a reservoir or something, and they'll hang out for a while. And then they'll eventually make it back to the coast. The American white pelican distribution in Louisiana is really different. It is coastal. They do occur on the coast. Again, they're mostly in marshes and lakes. But you can sort of see that there's a really strong pattern for these birds to be along the two major rivers, the Mississippi River and the Red River. And so, that just sort of follows their ecology. They're more freshwater. They spend, time in North Louisiana on reservoirs. And as I mentioned before, you may have seen them in Baton Rouge. They're really common on the the capital lakes from about, October through April. These birds show up in Baton Rouge usually there's a big pulse in early November. So a lot of those birds will continue on to, the coastal areas, but some will stay all winter, and then they'll mostly leave in, April or early May. And so these guys are pretty different, right? So we've talked about how they're different, sort of distribution-wise. They're obviously pretty different, just how they look, their plumage. Brown pelicans, mostly brown, pretty good name for this bird. White pelican is a really good name for a white pelican as well. Brown pelicans do show some age variation. You can see the bird in flight here for the brown pelican is an adult bird. It has the back of the head and the nape and the neck are white. Its belly is brown. Whereas the bird that's flying below here sort of has an all dusky, brownish, head, back, neck, and a whitish belly. American white pelican, on the hand, almost all white, and really contrasting black flight feathers, primaries and secondary feathers. And these guys don't really show a lot of age-related variation. Once they, are done, once the kids leave the nest, they molt out of their juvenile plumage, which only takes a few weeks, they basically look like adults. And so by the time they get here, they certainly mostly look like adults. So brown pelicans do require 3 to 4 years to attain their adult plumage. And here I'm trying to show anyway, a little more detail on adult versus immature birds. So adult, again, you can see sort of the white head, the white back of the neck, really dark brown belly, as opposed to the juvenile bird, which over here. This is a young bird, probably 2 years old. Again, really white belly. Interesting thing about these photos is they're both perched in cypress trees, which you don't see a whole lot for brown pelicans. Again, they're really coastal. But there are places, of course, where, these freshwater swamps and cypress trees get pretty close to the coast. And in those areas, you can see our state bird sitting in our state tree. Brown pelicans have a very different foraging behavior than white pelicans as well. You can see this, like if you're at Grand Isle and you have some birds foraging offshore or just offshore, you can see this. What they do is fly around maybe 20 meters or 60 feet above the water, sort of hover around, cruise around, and they sight their prey visually. When they sight something, they'll sort of fold up their wings, they'll tuck their wings back, and they'll go into the water head first. Right when they hit the water, they'll shove their wings back farther, give them an ability to accelerate toward their prey even a little faster, and then they'll scoop up, their targeted prey if they're successful, and up to 10 liters of water at the same time. If they're successful, and they primarily eat menhaden in the Gulf, as well as other small schooling fish like mullet, but primarily menhaden. But anyway, if they're successful, they'll come back to the surface of the water. They'll sort of tip their bill up above horizontal, drain out all the water, and then eat the prey. White pelicans are completely different. They'll forage. They do forage, I should say, on the surface. They're also looking for small fish, but they're a little more generalist. They'll eat, amphibians if they find them, sort of whatever, or in these freshwater bodies of water. Reptiles. They'll swim along, dip their bill in the water, and then scoop up, their targeted prey as well as a bunch of water, just like brown pelicans at that point. But the really neat thing about white pelicans foraging is they often forage in big groups. And so they'll cooperatively forage to herd their prey towards a more sheltered area or a shore, and then attack where they have a higher likelihood individually of success. And so moving away from white pelicans, moving into pelicans that are really identified with Louisiana. Louisiana is known as the Pelican State. We could go farther and say the Brown Pelican State, despite the incongruous image in the flag there, or the seal, which is also on the flag. It basically looks like a white pelican, although it doesn't really fully look like a white pelican either, because it doesn't have black primaries or secondaries. But this seal came along a long time before the brown pelican became our state bird. Historically in Louisiana, the brown pelican has been a very numerous bird. In the early part of last century, it's thought that 50,000 plus brown pelicans called the coastal Louisiana home. There's not really good abundance estimates that I'm aware of, but it was generally thought to be, at least over 50,000 birds. And so at that time, at that time, it was sort of thought of as an iconic bird of the coast. In 1902, the pelican, thought to be the brown pelican, was incorporated into the state seal, even though it doesn't look like a brown pelican. Huey Long, the governor, in the 30s, who had the current Capitol built, was a huge fan of pelicans, apparently. There are, images of pelicans in the masonry and the stonework of the Capitol. And then in 1966, the legislature designated the brown pelican officially as the state bird. That ironically coincided with a massive population decline in our brown pelicans. And at that time, Louisiana was the state without pelicans. In the 1950s, there was a very sharp population decline in brown pelicans on the Gulf Coast. And this was due to chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides, pesticides such as DDT that were in the environment at that time. The negative effects were sort of manifest in two different ways. One was the pesticides in the environment caused eggshell thinning. And what happened was when birds would go to incubate their eggs, they would actually crush their eggs. So this obviously dramatically reduced hatching success, dramatically reduced breeding productivity. The other way in which it affected our pelicans is that it actually caused direct mortality to adults and young birds through what is known as bioaccumulation. And so when toxins are in the environment, at every step higher and higher in the food chain, those toxins become amplified. Basically, the effects become magnified. And so there's these toxins in the water, it's in the plankton, it's taken up by the fish, it's amplified, and then by the time the pelicans eat up the fish, there are really negative effects. By 1961 was the last known pelican breeding event in the state during this time. And by 1963, the species was completely extirpated from Louisiana. However, what we're going to talk about really is the conservation success story that followed. So in the early 60s, there was a cooperative agreement between LDWF, the analogous agency in Florida, other partners, to translocate pelicans from successful, stable colonies, breeding colonies in Florida to Louisiana. And so between 1968 and 1976, 767 fledglings were taken from the Florida Atlantic coast, places like Port Orange, Crane Island, Hall Island. They were captured on those colonies by hand when the birds were 8 to 11 weeks old, put in trucks, taken to Louisiana, put on boats, and taken out to Grand Terre primarily. So off the eastern edge of Grand Isle. This effort was successful in establishing a colony at Queen Bess Island. And then between 1977 and 1980, an additional 509 fledglings were taken from Florida's Gulf Coast colonies, and they were taken to North Island and Isle of Pete, which are two islands in Chandeleur Sound. That effort successfully resulted in a breeding colony at North Island. And then within Louisiana, Wildlife and Fisheries moved 149 fledglings in the mid-'80s from Queen Bess, which by that time was a really successful colony, moved fledglings from there to Raccoon Island, which is in Terrebonne Parish, and that actually is currently our biggest most important pelican colony in terms of numbers of breeding birds and productivity. And so a couple things to look at on this slide. One is the picture. If you can sort of look at this picture, the dark blobs, those are adult pelicans sitting on nests. And so, since these efforts occurred, Wildlife and Fisheries has monitored these birds at known colonies by flying over an aircraft and counting the number of birds on nests. And so we do this when it's peak incubation, so it's easier to spot adults on nests, and you make some assumptions about the vast majority of birds being on incubation duty at that time, and you can count the birds on the island, basically. And so that's how that's been done since the 70s. And this figure here, the graph, is showing the number of estimated pairs on the y-axis across time. So from the 70s, or where do I start here? Yeah, late 70s, through the 80s, through the introduction period, to basically today, more or less. And so you can see how incredibly successful our population has rebounded. You don't really need to look at the dips so much. That's more or less years when there was less survey effort. Really just look at the overall curve. Going from basically zero to currently we have about 18,000 pairs that nest on our coast. This is the frontispiece and the title page from a paper that came out, a scientific paper that came out a couple of years ago, in which a group of biologists looked at various data sets, primarily the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries aerial survey data, and looked at estimates of population sizes for all of our coastal breeding species, and then sort of put that in the context of broader spatial scales to look at the importance of our populations that we manage basically in the state. And so Louisiana, if you look at this table, let me break it down real quick. So looking at a number of species here, brown pelican is highlighted. The estimated Louisiana population, we're saying 35,000 breeding birds, equivalent to about 18,000 pairs, as I mentioned before. The rank of that species, the population for that species in Louisiana compared to the other northern Gulf Coast states, okay? And then the contribution that our population makes throughout the Gulf of Mexico, the northern Gulf of Mexico, and then globally. And so brown pelicans, we have considerably more pelicans breeding our state than in any other state on the northern Gulf Coast. 47% of the brown pelicans that breed on the northern Gulf Coast breed in coastal Louisiana. And that's also almost a quarter of the brown pelicans that breed in the world. And I do want to point out, even though this is a brown pelican talk, I do want to point out that the same pattern occurs for a number of other coastal species. Sandwich tern is one, Forster's tern, royal tern, black skimmer, tricolored heron. These are all birds that Louisiana hosts the majority of the breeding individuals of all these birds for the northern Gulf Coast. And that's really a testament to the complexity of our coast. We have such a complex coast with so many different habitats. A lot of isolated islands, and that's what most of these birds need for successful breeding, is isolated remote islands that are free from mammalian predators. And so, we're really blessed to have such an incredible, coastal breeding bird community. So brown pelican colonies. I'm showing those in purple on that inset map, if you can see them. Again, I want to emphasize that these colonies are islands. They're small islands. They're very isolated and they're very remote. Okay, so all those things are very important for productivity. If mammals find these islands, they really do a lot of damage to productivity, and the birds actually will leave those islands. And so if you have a smaller island that's more remote, you have a less of a chance for a mammal actually finding it, swimming out and finding it, and certainly establishing a population of those mammals on those islands. So our colonies are super important. The coastal component, the coastal island component of those colonies is super important. This is a typical colony, image. If you approach a colony during breeding season, it's a crazy kind of place, super raucous, so many birds flying everywhere. You're going to get pooped on a lot. But it's a really neat place to sort of experience. In Louisiana, our pelicans nest usually from March to August. Incubation occurs primarily March to May, and then nestlings are in the nest from about April to June, sometimes into July. That's if the island doesn't get overwashed or there's not a predation event, some other sort of nest failure event. If there is, early enough in the season, the birds will renest, and so that sort of can protract the egg period and the nestling period into August, and even sometimes early September. In the photo to the lower left, I'm showing brown pelican nest with eggs. Pelicans lay between 1 and 3 eggs. And then as you sort of move along to the right, and that's a nest with young kids. Those kids are probably, just a week old. And then, once they get to the point where they leave the nest, after about 8 to 11 weeks, that's sort of what they look like. They form these groups of fledglings from different nests. Will get together in these groups called creches, and they'll hang out until they're, flying on their own and foraging on their own. Both adults will incubate the eggs. Both adults will feed the nestlings, as well as the kids after they leave the nest for a while anyway. And so, we had such an incredible success story for pelicans. And now we have a completely different challenge with respect to brown pelican conservation. And that is habitat loss that is stemming from coastal land loss. And so, the number of colonies, there was some work in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, showing that the number of colonies in Louisiana has declined dramatically. This one paper that looked at the period from 2002 to 2010 observed a loss from 30 to 10 colonies. That trend has really continued, basically. There has been some, new colonies formed, but the overall trend is continuing downward. Among the remaining colonies, the ones that still exist, there's an average loss of 67% of available habitat or area of habitat on those islands. And that's all because, one, erosion, the islands themselves are being eroded away. And then the islands that are remaining, well, they're also eroding, but they're also subsiding, they're also sinking. And so, not only do we have problems with overwash, back up. As you lose area, you lose the capacity of an island to host, a certain number of nests. So that's one problem. Also, as these islands subside and sink, you have more and more overwash issues, more and more inundation issues, and so you have nest failure that results from inundation. And so I briefly want to go through, we talk a lot about land loss in Louisiana and a lot about, the acreage that's lost every 10 minutes or whatever. But I think it's really more effective to convey what's happening, both large-scale coastal land loss, but in particular to brown pelican colonies with a series of sort of case studies. And so this is Wine Island. You can see in 2007 that it was a decent-sized island. About 500 pairs of pelicans nested here, as well as thousands of other pairs of other terns, skimmers, herons. This island, you can sort of see what happened to it over time. It does not even exist anymore at all. It is completely gone. This was an important colony that was gone within, 13 years for sure. Raccoon Island, both of these are in Terrebonne Bay. Raccoon Island is just a few miles to the west. This is currently our most important colony. And over 5,000 pairs of pelicans nest here. You can see how it has changed over time. It's basically about half the size that it was in 2004. And I do want to emphasize this as well. The only reason that it currently exists in the state that it does is because of two restoration projects that have occurred there. You can sort of see on the bottom fringe of the island what looks like little points jutting out. Those are breakwaters. And then on the northern side of the island, you can see sort of a little outline here. That was a marsh platform restoration project that was put in to sort of try to maintain the area of that island. And so, these islands are just under constant threat, and without active restoration efforts, they will go away under current conditions. Mangrove Island is my last example, and I really focus on this one because this sort of brings it home as far as Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill disaster. This was an island off of Grand Isle. It was sort of ground zero during the oil spill. It was close to Grand Isle. A lot of media went out there. This was a brown pelican colony. This is where the first oil brown pelican kids were, seen, videoed, put on the news. And so this was kind of a big deal, media-wise, attention-wise, bringing this to the public attention. This, as it was called, Mangrove Island, it did consist of mangroves, and that's where the pelicans nested. The mangroves were so heavily oiled that they died, and within 4 years, with nothing to hold the island together, it was completely underwater again as well. And so there's another brown pelican colony lost, exacerbated by the oil spill. And the reason I mentioned oil spill, I'll circle back to that in just a second. But as I mentioned, of the colonies that we do have remaining that have not been washed away yet, we have a subsidence issue. Relative sea level rise and subsidence are sort of acting together. The elevation that we have on these islands for the birds to nest above the water is decreasing as we go over time. And so this is Rabbit Island. This is the only colony in western Louisiana. This is in Calcasieu Lake. The elevation of this island has decreased such that we're seeing up to 50% nest failure there due to inundation problems. And so I do want to talk about land loss real quick before I dial it back in on pelicans and pelican colony restoration. And I know I just sort of pointed out that I hate throwing out these numbers. But between 1932 and 2010, we did lose about 18,000 square miles of land in coastal Louisiana. During 2004 to 2008 alone, we lost 300 square miles due to hurricanes, Katrina, Rita, Ike, and Gustav. It's well established that without aggressive restoration, we are projected to lose 4,000 additional square miles, or 2/3 of the remaining coastal wetlands, if we do not implement the Coastal Master Plan that has been developed by CPRA, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. And so, one thing that CPRA does is model land loss scenarios over time. This is one such modeling in which we're looking at land change in 50 years under a moderate scenario, so not an extreme scenario, not a low scenario, but a moderate scenario of land loss, if we do not enact the restoration efforts that are set forth in the master plan. And you can see, just pretty obviously, that we will not have much in the way of brown pelican colonies if this happens. There is a lot of coastal restoration that is going on right now. This is just sort of a select group of barrier island projects that have been going on for the last 10, 15 years. Some of these are huge projects. Some of these restore over 1,000 acres. And so this is really amazing work. It creates a lot of really great bird habitat, at least for a few years. One thing that brown pelicans are different. Most of our colonial birds that nest along the coast, they like that bare sand, that early successional habitat that comes in after a storm or a restoration event. They'll breed there for like 2 or 3 years. But then once the vegetation sort of develops, they'll move on. But my point in saying this is there's a ton of incredible restoration work going on in the state that is benefiting birds, even though this is not designed to benefit birds. Most of this work is designed to protect the coast, right? But birds do benefit. This is one example that was on that previous map, Caillou Lake Headlands, Whiskey Island. These projects have an incredible potential to benefit birds. This was one of the very first projects to stem from the Deepwater oil spill settlement. So this was a natural resources damage assessment early restoration project put in place through the BP oil spill. It's one of the largest projects to date. Over 11 million cubic yards of sediment were pumped from offshore onto this island, created really incredible least tern habitat, black skimmer habitat. Those populations really skyrocketed on this island after they put this fresh sediment down. But like I said, this is not designed for bird habitat. It provides bird habitat, at least for a while, but it's designed for coastal protection. However, also related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and the settlement, there was a pot of money that was specifically allocated towards birds. And so what I want to talk about now is the coastal restoration work that's going on that is specifically designed for birds. The Louisiana Trustee Implementation Group, or TIG, that's the group that sort of allocates the monies from BP settlement that were devoted to Louisiana. In its first restoration plan for what's called restoration type birds, that's money that's allocated towards birds specifically. It implemented two projects. One was Queen Bess Island and one was Rabbit Island. I've mentioned both of those already. Queen Bess was that first spot where pelicans established a breeding colony when they were moved from Florida to Grand Terre. It had been restored in the past. In fact, I think this was one of the very first coastal restoration projects ever done in Louisiana. But you can see in that top photo, that's what it looked like 3 years ago, prior to the current restoration project. You can see that, you can kind of see three different cells, and that stems from the earlier restoration work, and they sort of degraded at different rates. The cell on the left was completely open water. The cell in the middle was half open water, well on its way to being open water. And the cell on the right still had, some marsh. But there was only about 5 acres of this island that was still suitable brown pelican habitat. They could nest basically on the dikes that went through the different cells that stemmed from that earlier restoration project. And so in this first post-Deepwater Horizon bird project, we restored this island. We pumped sediment onto the island up to about 3.5 foot elevation in those sort of left and middle cells. And so you're looking at the island the same way in the top and the bottom. Top is like I said, 2017, I think, and this is just after restoration was complete in the spring of 2020. And so we raised elevation about 3.5 feet on the far left, about 3 feet in the middle, and then the marsh on the right that was still somewhat intact was basically nourished throughout this process. So it was not, terribly disturbed during the process, but was nourished. We sort of refurbished the rock ring around the island and put in some breakwaters on the side of the island that had the highest energy action from waves. This is the same image, basically looking down on it, just sort of trying to emphasize some of the design features. In that highest elevation raised area, 3.5 foot, we put down crushed limestone, and that was sort of trying to mimic shell fragments. That's one of those early successional habitat types that the terns and the black skimmers and those sorts of birds will really use. And then this was revegetated using salt matrimony vine, Iva, baccharis, coastal shrubs that will do well in this environment and that the pelicans will actually nest in. That island, I should say before I move on, that restoration was incredibly successful. That they basically pulled the equipment off of the island in February, and within a week or two, literally, pelicans came in and started nesting. They produced, they had a really good production of fledglings in that first year as well as this past year. So that's been really successful, which was really important, as being the first project, being such a sort of symbolic project, being Queen Bess Island. It was very satisfying that was successful. Rabbit Island is the second project that was funded in that first bird allocation. This is an approximately 200-acre marsh island in Calcasieu Lake. It's an important site for brown pelicans, about 200 nests. 200 breeding pairs of pelicans are here, or they have been, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's really important because strategically, it's the only colony in western Louisiana. And so, ideally you have different colonies sort of throughout the coast. So if there's a catastrophic event like an oil spill or a hurricane that wipes out multiple colonies, they're spread out enough so that they have, options. And so that's, the main reason why this site is so important. This island also has, probably 2,500 nests of different wading bird species. One of the larger colonies of red egret, which is a species of conservation concern in Louisiana. This is one of the sites that I mentioned before where we had such a problem with subsidence and nest inundation, nest failure due to inundation. That's sort of what that photo is showing here. Those are brown pelican eggs that are actually sitting in water and thus not viable. But that's what it looks like now, or immediately following restoration last March. Yeah, a year ago. It was completed in March 2021. Again, brown pelicans moved on immediately after the restoration was done. They bred successfully. Also on this first sort of breeding season, we had gold-billed terns breeding, black skimmers, laughing gulls. A lot of those other coastal species that we're concerned about are benefiting from these pelican-specific projects as well. Bretton Island, I'm not going to talk a lot about Bretton Island. It's a federal property. Louisiana didn't have a whole lot to do with this restoration project, but I mention it because it's probably in the top 5 most important brown pelican breeding colonies that we have, and it was recently restored as well. This is in Chandler Sound, just south of the main Chandler Island chain. We now have 2 additional small bird islands. They're sort of analogous to Queen Bess and Rabbit that I just talked about. The engineering and design for these projects is going on now. It was just recently funded in Restoration Plan number 7. Again, using that bird-specific pot of money. And basically, they're both going to have a lot of the same design features that Queen Bess and Rabbit Island have. Raising the elevation, where necessary, putting in breakwaters or coastline protection, depending on the wave action, the wave energy that impacts these areas. Isle of Pete, that's in Chandler Sound. That's actually one of the islands where birds were transplanted from Florida. But it has shrunk to about 2 acres of suitable pelican nesting habitat. It's almost gone. So the goal here is to restore this to about 20 acres. And then Terrebonne H&C Island, that's in Terrebonne Bay, restore that to about 32 acres. It's currently down to about 10 acres. Same factors impacting all of these. It's really, it's a real trade-off. We talked about how these birds need these isolated, remote, small islands to be free from predators, but that's exactly the front line for coastal land loss. That's where all the energy hits when storms and inundation from relative sea level rise. So it's a real balancing act. 2 other big projects to mention are Chandler Island. This is a huge project. This will be the biggest project, coastal restoration project to be attempted in Louisiana to this point. This is being funded again through Deepwater Horizon Settlement, although not through Louisiana. It's through the region-wide trustee implementation group. So this has stakeholders across the Gulf Coast. But this island chain is incredibly important to birds on the sort of broader Gulf Coast scale. This is one of our most important islands for producing a number of species of greatest conservation concern, and these birds do move across state lines and throughout the Gulf. An interesting part about this is the engineering and design, which is currently underway, is being funded through bird money again. And so this will be the first big project. I mentioned those other big projects that benefit birds, but they weren't designed for birds. This one actually is using bird money in the design. And so this has an even more impact or potential impact to benefit our birds. And finally, the last project I'll talk about is Raccoon Island. The one that I mentioned before with the breakwaters are currently our most important colony. It keeps suffering, it keeps shrinking, especially that north side. And so there is going to be a project in the next few years to restore this island as well. So I'll move on from that. And actually, I've just got a few more slides. I want to talk a little bit more about how we monitor these birds. I mentioned that we use aerial surveys, fly over, count nests. That's what's been done since the 70s. With resources that are available through Deepwater, tied to these other projects, all these projects that I've mentioned, we're now using aerial nest photographic surveys to document what's going on. And this is a really rigorous, repeatable, and very accurate method where, again, you're using a fixed-wing aircraft and you're flying over, but you're actually taking photos, high-resolution photos of the island, sort of every square inch of the island that has nests on it. And so you take these images, that's what one of those photographs looks like. And so you have one photographer taking these high resolution photos of birds and nests on the ground, another biologist in the plane taking more broad scale contextual photos. All of these are GPS referenced, so you know exactly where they are. And then what happens is we take all these photos. I don't, but we take all these photos, and you can sort of see how painstaking this must be. If you look at the green dots, those are all royal terns, and the blue dots are all sandwich terns. And so this is a huge colony on the Shondalar Islands. And so we go through and we do what's called dotting of all of these photos. Each individual bird on a nest is dotted according to the species, which remarkably can identify the species in most cases for birds bigger than about that. Delineate the colonies so that you're not double counting birds. Like these are images, parts of the colonies that are adjacent to each other. They overlap, and so you have to sort of draw these red lines to delineate so you're not double counting birds. But then this is all fed through computer software that then spits out, this is how many sandwich terns you have on this colony. This is how many royal tern nests you have on this colony, and so on and so forth. And so this is a really exciting and accurate way that we can really track the birds that we have in a couple of different contexts. One is for all these bird-specific restoration projects, it's really important to know, what we're producing, what the effect is it successful, and be able to, accurately and quantitatively say, yeah, we built this, it now has this many birds on it. But this is also being employed on a broader scale, a coast-wide scale within Louisiana, as well as the broader coast, because it's also important to be able to know, how many birds are there across the entire coast. Like I said, these birds don't really pay attention to state lines too much. So we want to know not only how many nests, are coming on or that we have stemming from the conservation, the Bird Island projects that we're implementing in Louisiana, but how it's changing, across the Gulf as well. And that'll be really important in designing future projects, adapting lessons learned from our current projects and building a broader restoration portfolio. And with that, we can entertain questions or discuss anything that anybody wants to talk about.
The projects you're doing, is there built-in resilience to future hurricanes and stuff, or will they get wiped away every time a hurricane comes?
Well, I mean, they're built to withstand. They're built with the idea of having a 20-year life cycle. The vast majority of them. So yes, but I mean, there's only so much you can do. Like so Queen Bess was impacted by Hurricane Ida, right? But it actually held up really well. Some sediment was sort of shifted around. There was some scouring, but it held up remarkably well.
But you're putting in like rocks around the edges or something to...
Yeah, it all sort of depends on the specific situation. Queen Bess definitely had that. Rabbit Island did not. And that's another component of these projects. Built into the budget of these projects is something called operations and maintenance. And so if you get 5 years down the road and you're having a problem, like shoreline erosion at Rabbit Island, that actually is a problem at Rabbit Island. And so what they're going to do is use that operations and maintenance budget to go in and make basically a fix or implement some sort of design to protect against that problem that you have. So yeah, it's built in to the design, hopefully, and certainly the budget. Yeah.
With potentially elevating water globally, things of that nature.
Elevating what?
Elevating sea levels, things of that nature.
Oh, right.
How are there any plans to project for if there were, say, hypothetically, a sudden rise in sea level or anything like that to help with this situation?
Right. Not to my knowledge. Most of the modeling that goes into this work is above my head. I'll just say that right off the bat. But no, I mean it's based on the current models that CPRA is using. To the degree that they are looking at sudden rises, I'm not aware if there is.
So with the islands that are disappearing, are you seeing the birds shift back toward the land to other islands? Is that occurring?
Yeah, we don't really know because we don't have, most of these birds aren't marked, and so it's really hard to follow, individual birds moving. But they do move among islands, but it's not something that's been looked at closely. Now that we're starting to get this imagery, this among different islands, you can start to look at that. But we've only had this information, for a few years now, and these restoration projects have only been going on for a few years now.
Now, the one that you showed at the turns, are you getting some kind of infrared readout that tells you how many of each that you have, or do you have somebody down there counting those things? Just out of curiosity?
No, it's this right here.
Okay.
Yeah, somebody goes through and counts each bird. Assume, and there are a few assumptions here. They're generally safe assumptions, but we're assuming each one of these birds is sitting on a nest. So these flights are done during the peak of incubation, and there are actually two flights: one to account for the peak in these guys, and one to account for the peak of breeding in pelicans. They can be off a little bit. And so when this is done, it's done twice. It's done the third week of May, and then again the third week of June.
One other question: Chandelier Islands. How you talked about the restoration project?
Right.
How much is there? How much is it going to grow by?
Yeah, I can't answer that because it's currently in engineering and design,
Gotcha.
and so until that is done, we have no idea what the design will actually look like. But I can say that what's being considered, or the goal is to do the northern part of what remains of the current Chandelier Island, as well as New Harbor Island. I should mention that. New Harbor Island is a colony, a brown pelican colony, that's just on the sound side of Chandelier Island and has been degrading. And so the idea here is, while you have all of this work going on, the equipment mobilized out there to restore Chandelier Island, you work on New Harbor as well. So that's going to be part of that. You got a question?
Yeah. Okay, this is kind of a long shot. There's a white pelican that's been on the Capitol Lake by itself for over a year.
Yeah.
Y'all know any?
No, I mean, so a handful of those birds hang around every year, like on the coast, like down, by Venice, down in the rural coastal marshes. There's always a handful that hang around every year, and they could be young birds. A lot of times, what happens with I don't know about white pelicans specifically, but a lot of birds that are long distance migrants that breed way up north and winter down here. Some of those, a handful of that population, will often remain here during the summer. And they're typically young birds, first year, second year birds. They're not likely going to breed if they go back up north. And so it's thought to be a strategy to increase their survival. Like if they're not going to be able to breed, then why make the journey all the way up, north to breeding grounds? And so it's thought to be pretty common, a decision that's made by young birds to stick around. Now, whether that's the case of this bird, who knows? It could simply be injured, or who knows?
Yeah, I was just wondering if they ever made that choice. I'm just going to.
Yeah, no. Apparently, it is made. Yeah, because it's something that we see a lot with a number of different species, in which with this sort of migration pattern.
It just occurred to me, is there any impact of fresh water versus salt water for the pelicans in terms of getting their fish and everything? Does that matter?
Yeah, well, it matters in the sense that they're primarily menhaden consumers, and similar fishes. And so that sort of salinity regime is important to them. Yeah. So yeah, like freshwater could certainly alter that, mm-hmm. Or shift things up anyway.
But in terms of how they eat, it doesn't matter what water they're taking in or anything.
What, brown pelican specifically?
Yeah, brown and white. I mean, just birds.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a physiology question that I don't know if I can answer. I suspect that there are physiological differences between the two. Brown pelican being, mostly saline, and white pelican being mostly freshwater. I would strongly suspect there would be differences. I don't know how they deal with it.
Quick question about miming. I'm pretty sure I don't think they're critically endangered or anything.
Right.
But with the growth of brown pelicans hopefully on the rise, is there a holistic look over at the overall ecological system with that to make sure that their food supplies and things like that are also kept at a reasonable rate, or at least monitored to prevent any potential collapses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. At some level, it is monitored because it's such an important commercial fishery. But the degree to which that's really considered, who knows? There's a lot of commercial fisheries that are. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
How long do they generally live? And I didn't realize it took that long for them to mature. So generally, how long do they live?
Yeah, 15, 20 years, sometimes longer.
Really?
Yeah, they're long-lived birds. Yeah.
I had no idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Longer than that at times.
I just never.
I don't know what the average lifespan is, but I would expect it to be 15 to 20. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the mammals that would threaten the population
Yeah.
if they were to get on these ice
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
What kind of mammals are common predators?
Yeah, it's coyotes and raccoons are two of the two biggest ones. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they make their way out there pretty regularly to some of these really isolated places.
Are there any hawks or anything that would attack the nesting site?
No, I don't think I've certainly never seen that or heard of that. Most of the hawks that occur out here are going after small stuff, northern harriers, peregrine falcons, merlins, that sort of thing. They're going after birds, but small birds, I should say. And then during the breeding season, as far as nest predators, there really aren't any hawks out there during the nesting season. The hawks that occur in these coastal islands are really more of a wintertime phenomenon. Birds that are down from up north. Yeah.
Are neighbor states also doing restoration?
Yeah. And Alabama, I want to say, has a bird. I shouldn't say that. The answer is yes. Texas is doing quite a lot of stuff. I can't speak to the details because I'm simply not as familiar with the details. But yeah, all the Gulf states got some allocation for bird restoration. And then also, like I mentioned, the region-wide pot of money also has bird money that goes to different projects that sort of spread around the different states of the Gulf. Yeah. I think I'm not familiar with anything in other states to this point that's sort of to the scale of what we've done so far. But that makes sense. Our colonies were most impacted. Louisiana's share of the money was much higher than other states because our coastline was so disproportionately impacted and our bird populations were so disproportionately impacted. But yes, it is occurring.
How much money were they talking about? 15, $20 billion or?
For the whole thing?
Yeah, that BP put up?
It was absurd. I can't remember. It was a lot.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been too long. And those numbers are so big that they sort of yeah.
What are some things that the average person in Louisiana can do to help wildlife fisheries or the CPRA or anything like that in these restoration efforts? So like the average person maybe like, of course we want to get educated.
Yeah, I mean that's the first thing, right? Is understanding the problem, the magnitude of the problem, what it's going to mean for our future, not only our bird life, of course, but also our working coast, our fisheries, our recreation, that sort of thing. But as far as action, I would say just being engaged and and being educated on coastal restoration projects. You know, there are a ton of projects going on, and so being able to discuss those, educated or intelligently with with people, I think is a big help, because it's like anything. If you're farther removed, you may place different priorities on what you read without knowing sort of what all is going into it. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'd just say be educated and be engaged.
So your nesting area in Shreveport, you say that your island is sinking.
Wait, where?
Did you say something about you had a nesting area somewhere up in North Louisiana?
Oh no.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Calcasieu Lake, though, I mentioned the island was subsiding. Yeah.
Okay.
And relative sea level rise. Yeah, both.
Okay.
That's one of the projects where that was just completed, where we raised the elevation
Right.
again to about 3 feet. And the birds returned and nested. There's been one breeding season since that was completed, and they returned and nested. And it was actually fairly interesting. They returned where they typically had nested was not a part of the island that was dramatically raised, because we're trying to keep some of that vegetation in place so that the birds, so it would look a little bit familiar to them, right, when they came back. And they did try to nest in that area, and they did get inundated in that first year post-restoration. But then they moved, exactly what we would have hoped them to do. They moved to a higher point on the island, and they were successful. So it was really, really nice. Convenient. Yeah.
Well, that West Hackberries in Calcasieu Lake
Yeah.
is different in that it is not exposed to the Gulf waves,
Right.
Gulf storm,
Right.
because it's inland from that.
Yeah.
So it's strictly subsidence.
Exactly. Yeah.
Are any of these islands, I'm not a fisher person, but are they accessible for people to see actually what's going on?
They're hard to get to. I mean, if you're an experienced boater, certainly. Yeah, I mean, people fish in these areas, all the time, but they are challenging to get to.
They're remote.
They're remote. Yeah. You don't want to give it a shot unless you know what you're doing. Get caught in a storm. Get lost. It all looks the same, once you get into these coastal marshes and these networks and mosaics of different islands, different marsh islands, it all looks the same. I used to work on Whiskey Island, and I would go down there, every 10 days, and I'd take the same route. And without the GPS, I can get turned around pretty easy.
Are there any pelicans in the Pontchartrain lakes?
They do, not nesting. They will come up in there and forage, though. Yeah, but no nesting. Yeah. Chandelier Sound, which is nearby, there are several small colonies. Yeah.
I guess what is the best resource or website to go to like stay up to date on different restoration information?
Yeah, CPRA's website. Yeah. Also, let's see. There are a couple more that I would like to tell you. Let me think. After the talk, I'll get to you because it'll come to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're too young for that. That happens to me all the time.
Restore the Mississippi Delta, I think is what I'm trying to think of. But I'll give it a little more thought.
We can always ask Google.
I know, that's what I was about to do.
As we we collect some more resources, we can add them to readonebook.org, which is the One Book One Community info guide that we've been updating. So if you have any, you can
Oh, okay,
come to me
okay,
and I'll put
okay.
them up there.
Okay, great.
But,
Sure, yeah, let's do that.
well, thank you so much.
Oh,
Mr.
thank you.
Dobbs. We
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thank you so much